bit of a heat wave here, so I've been kind of collapsing with dehydration a little bit, but hopefully I'll get through this. Okay, well, I've done a couple more slides, just based on the interactions earlier in the day, that are really nothing to do with my main talk, but I thought I'd throw them in anyway. And slides about really how I understand the problem of consciousness, how I think about the I assume we're recording this, aren't we? I think Raoul and Sabrina. Anyway, okay. How I think about the problem of consciousness, why I think it's such a unique problem, and why I think just doing science isn't enough, although of course the science is incredibly crucial. So I'll just kick off with 2 slides about that, and then I'll talk about something completely different. So as David hinted at earlier, the way I've framed the discussion is all in terms of what I call transparent concepts, which are sort of essence revealing concepts. And this differs from how David Chalmers set up the issue and the challenge for physicalism. So this is something, a little bit of a different way of approaching it, that myself and Martina Niederrümelin have put forth. So here's roughly my definition of a transparent concept. A concept C referring to a property P is transparent just in case C reveals what it is for something to have P. So perhaps this is made clear with an example. I think sphericity is a transparent concept, right? For something to be spherical is for all points on its surface to be equidistant from its center. That's what it is to be a sphere, and you know that from the concept, right? From the concept, maybe through a priori reasoning, you know the essence of a sphere, by which I mean simply what it is for something to be spherical. Whereas water, in contrast, is an opaque concept. It's not transparent, right? We don't know what it is for something to be water until we do some science, right? We can just kind of refer to it, and then we have to do science to find out that for something to be water is for it to be made of H2O molecules. So I think this is a fairly plausible distinction. I don't think it's just mathematical concepts that are transparent, although they're the nicest case because you can give the definition really clearly. But I think maybe the concept of a party is transparent. You know what it is for something to be a party is for it to be people getting together, dancing, drinking, etc. It's hard to pin down exactly what it is, but I still think it's a transparent concept. Okay, so that's the general framework. So let's turn to the case of consciousness. Here we need to focus on what David Papineau introduced earlier, phenomenal concepts, which are concepts that pick out experiences in terms of what it's like to have them. So my claim is that phenomenal concepts are transparent, like the concept of sphericity, like the concept of a party. Insofar as you know, just to take an example of a given pain you're feeling at a particular moment, insofar as you know how a given pain feels, you know what it is to feel that way, right? So the concept reveals the essence of the property. So just as the concept of sphericity reveals what it is for something to be spherical, I think the concept of feeling a certain way, of what it's like to feel a certain way, reveals to you what it is to feel that way. I mean, I think this is pretty intuitive, that a feeling is essentially defined by how it feels. That's by stipulation. We're defining it as a certain way of feeling. And so when you know how it feels, you know what it is to feel that way. So if that sounds trivial, I hope so. I think it is trivial, but I think the kind of physicalist view Papineau defends, for example, requires denying that. We could maybe get into that in Q&A. So note very crucially, and this came up with some of the discussion earlier, this doesn't entail we're infallible about our conscious experience, that we never make mistakes. I'm very much open, for example, to what Ned Block calls overflow, that there is much of the specificity of our conscious experience we don't have cognitive access to. I'm very open to Eric Schwitzgebel's shown that, we make mistakes about our conscious experience. The claim here is just insofar as the phenomenal concepts get it right, then to that extent we grasp the essence of our conscious states. Okay? But, I think although we do make mistakes, we don't want to go to the other extreme. I think we have a very significant grasp of how our pains feel, of what it's like to have our conscious states. And to that extent, I would say we grasp the essence of those states. We know what it is to feel that way, to experience that way. So this is utterly unique. You know, any other scientific phenomenon, lightning, you know, water, you don't know what the hell it is till you do the science. Is lightning the anger of the gods? Is water a fundamental element? But with consciousness, I think in the nuanced, I hope, way I've just articulated, we have a significant grasp of what it essentially is before we do the science. So this is how I understand very finally, the problem of consciousness. I think the challenge is that we need to marry what we know about the essential nature of consciousness from the inside with what we know about the brain from the outside. Right, that's the challenge, and I've argued that panpsychism gives the best way of doing that. I think once we frame the challenge in this way, I've argued sort of physicalism no longer really makes sense. We could perhaps debate that, but anyway, that is an utterly unique scientific problem, if you want to call it that. Usually, you know, we just look to science to tell us what things are. In this case, it's a very different explanatory project. And I just think we're not even at first base until we get clear on that. And I think that's a large reason we're not making progress. Okay, so, and now I'm going to talk about something completely different, but we could talk about that the whole Q&A if you like. So I would like to talk about a recent experience I had, quite unusual experience that I can't stop thinking about. So recently, in very controlled circumstances, under the supervision of a trained therapist, I self-administered something known as 5-MeO-DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic. It's also a form of toad venom, although I had it in a synthesized form. And as I'm saying, whenever I talk about this, I advise people not to do this. I think it was a very, very frightening experience. And I think when people talk about psychedelics, it's not often emphasized enough. I think there are psychological dangers. They're not generally thought to be physically dangerous or addictive. And so it's sort of ridiculous that they're classed as type A drugs in the UK alongside heroin and cocaine. But I think they can be psychologically dangerous. They tear apart our ordinary ways of thinking, and often those ordinary ways of thinking are important for psychological stability. And because of the legal situation, it's not often possible to do what I was lucky enough to do, to be able to do it in very controlled circumstances to mitigate those risks. Even then, it was terrifying. But anyway, having said that, I had this experience. I'd like to think about the philosophical implications. I'm going to do two things. The first thing I want to do is use the skills of analytic philosophy to try and pin down the content of this experience. That is to say, how things seem to be when having it. And it's a really nice case, 5-MeO-DMT, because you can read what other people have said about this experience. Michael Pollan, Christoph Koch. It's a very uniform experience. There's nothing kind of, you don't meet elves, you don't sort of have visuals, it's a very sort of pure ego dissolution experience. Anyway, the second task though is I want to argue that it's rational for me to trust the experience. That is to say, to believe that things really are as they seem to be when I had this experience. Yes, I can't remember whether we said, if I would like to record this if we was a quick interchange before that. If you're able to start recording that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. I meant to talk about that before we started. Okay. Anyway, so first task, let's get clear on the content of the experience. So again, we're bracketing for the moment whether this is a hallucination or veridical, just how things seemed. And here's how things seemed. When I took this self-administered substance, I was very, very quickly entirely annihilated, right? Philip Goff no longer existed. I was wiped from existence. But something remained, and what remained was an indescribable form of consciousness, radically different from ordinary consciousness, a form of consciousness that was beyond space, beyond time, and which belonged to nobody. So it wasn't my consciousness. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper penetrate some of these claims and try and pin them down a little bit more using the skills of analytic philosophy. You might be thinking, well, in what sense was it part of the content that I wasn't there, or that, you know, it wasn't my consciousness? I mean, maybe I wasn't representing myself, but in what sense was it part of the experience that I wasn't there? And I would say that again, just talking about how things seemed, this was, if I can put it this way, a region of reality in which there is no differentiation, no way of dividing reality into distinct countable aspects, no way of distinguishing between I and other, this and that. So this, you know, obviously differs from ordinary consciousness. Even if you're talking about your own mind, you can distinguish between, you know, the left and right half of your visuals field, for example, different aspects of your experience. This was a region of reality in which these kind of concepts of differentiation had no application. Okay, now you might say, well, okay, so maybe even if we take this to be veridical, couldn't it just be a part of your consciousness in which there's no differentiation, right? There's no kind of left and right part or whatever. There's no different aspects. Well, digging a bit deeper, I would say, again, just talking about the content, this was a region of reality in which there was absolutely no. Oh, I echoed back on myself a bit then. I don't know what happened. I'll just carry on and hope it doesn't happen again. I echoed absolutely. It was quite a sort of mystical moment. Anyway, okay. So there was absolutely no quantificational structure, right? So it wasn't the case that there is an X such that ... So this wasn't just existence monism. There is only one thing. This was a region of reality in which there is not even one thing. There is nothing that exists. And this is, you know, a familiar claim for what it's worth. You find in mystics throughout history that, you know, it's not even, doesn't even exist, sort of beyond existence and non-existence, if you like. And I would say that was part of the content here. Well, I've contradicted myself a little bit because I've quantified over region of reality a few times now. So let me again, using those, it's wonderful using the skills of analytic philosophy to get the precision and rigor to this esoteric topic. Let me pin it down, I hope, in a precise and clear way. I would say that here there is propositional content, but it is a completely unstructured propositional truth claim. So a propositional truth claim with no quantificational structure, no subject predicate, but nonetheless with content, just completely structureless content. I found Ted Sider in his book, Writing the Book of the World, helpful for making sense of the coherence of these unusual metaphysical truth claims. Okay, so I think I would like to say, although what the claim I'm making here, the claim I'm discussing, the content can be put in a quite precise way. I mean, just one more thing. I'm not saying during the experience there was a proposition I was entertaining. I certainly wasn't. But thinking back on the memory, I think I can form a proposition that is completely structureless, but I can think about, I could say, for example, I believe that, or I disbelieve that, depending on whether I think the experience was a hallucination or veridical. So that's what I'm saying. I think there was propositional content here, even though it wasn't entertained in the moment of the experience. Oh, yes. Well, okay, that was a bit boring and abstract. Let me put a metaphor that captures how things seem in this experience. And this is very common. Everyone I've read who has this experience, right? So imagine a light bulb covered in cotton wool, right? So then the cotton wool is sort of the specificities of my mind, my conscious mind. And then the light bulb is this sort of timeless, spaceless, impersonal consciousness. And then how it seemed in the experience is the cotton wool is just torn away, is just destroyed, and then all that remains is this impersonal consciousness. Okay, and it was absolutely bloody terrifying. It really was frightening. I mean, much of the content there, I think, was I did it once. And I'm not in a position to do that again. I had the experience I wanted to have, and that was it. I'm not going to be doing it again in a hurry. But I mean, much of the content, I think, is just that I think there is positive content here. It's obviously some sort of ineffable if you haven't had the experience. But then, I don't think that's different to seeing the qualitative character of a read experience, for example. You can't communicate that to a colorblind person. Okay, so I think there's some ineffable positive content here. What makes it distinctive, I think, is the negatives. It's that there is no space, no time, no differentiation, no quantification or structure. Okay, but there is positive content. I think that maybe the only positive characteristic was experience. There was experience. I did a thing with the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig recently, and he's saying, well, was there value in this experience? Were there any value properties? And I mean, I guess I would say there was something awesome in the non-American sense of that word. I mean, this is sort of like Old Testament fear and trembling. This was just like, I mean, to give a metaphor, it was like a raging storm. It was like fucking hell. It's just unbearable, but also kind of wondrous in some sense. Like there was something. It did seem something of great value, but it was sort of too terrifying and overwhelming to sort of enjoy that value. Okay, so much for the content. Let's get to the million-dollar question that I'm sure we're going to disagree on. Was this a hallucination? Was it veridical? Were things really as they seem? So look, I think this is a truth claim. I think look, I'm going to have to talk slightly loosely because this is so hard to talk about. To speak slightly loosely, if this was veridical, there is a region of reality beyond space, beyond time, in which there is a form of consciousness that belongs to nobody. So that's what the experience represented. So if it's veridical, that is a very radical truth about the nature of reality. So I want to ask, is it rational for me to believe that truth claim? And I want to argue that it is. So how do we answer that? Well, we need to set our biases on. I would encourage everyone to set their biases on one side, right? There's going to be cultural biases to say, oh, it's obviously a hallucination, or it's obviously not if it's a genuine. We just need to set our biases on one side and look at theories of rational justification, theories of what makes belief rational, what makes it rational to believe something or not believe something. I do feel we're well trained in Western intellectual circles to be wary of religious bias. But I think there are lots of different kinds of biases, and we need to be very wary of them and just sort of try and objectively consider the question. Of course, there's lots to debate and dispute. Okay, so I'm going to start with my first theory of the nature of justification, of what makes belief rational, namely phenomenal conservatism. If it seems to S that P, then in the absence of defeaters, S thereby has at least some justification for believing the P. Okay, so this is the fact that something seems a certain way to you gives you some grounds to believe it in the absence of some reason to think that belief is false. Perhaps most associated with Michael Huemer. Okay, now this sounds ridiculous at first, like, just because something seems a certain way, why does that give you any reason to believe it? Well, I think the case for it is, at least if we're starting from an internalist theory of justification, I'm going to get to externalist theories in a moment, but at least if we're starting with internalist justification, theories of justification, rather, where the grounds of justification have to be, in some sense, accessible to us. If we're starting from that, and we don't want to end up with skepticism about the external world, we have to accept something like this. That would be the argument, I think. So if we want to avoid skepticism about the external world, we have to accept something like this, because, you know, ultimately, I mean, maybe we're assuming a sort of foundationalist view. I'll get to coherentism as well. You know, ultimately, what have we got that is a candidate for justifying belief in the external world? I think ultimately it's just, this seems to be an external world, right? Perceptually seems to be, you know, when I look around me. Now, of course, we can test whether you're hallucinating or whatever, but only by trusting your senses, right? You know, you have to trust those perceptual seemings to get anything off the ground, okay? Including, actually, you have to trust your memory seemings. You know, I mean, all you've really got direct access to, I would say, is, you know, how things seem here and now, you know, including memory seemings. So unless it's okay to trust those initial seemings, we're going to end up not knowing whether we're in the matrix. Okay, so that's roughly the argument for that. Okay, but crucially, there's this qualification, you know, in the absence of a defeater. And so it's not a free-for-all, right? You can't accept everything that seems to be true, because we've got to take into account defeaters. So now let's think about my 5-MeO toad venom experience at DMT. So firstly, it bloody seemed, I mean, it seemed, and this is very common with psychedelic experience, it seems more real than the external world as known in ordinary consciousness, right? So the seeming is definitely there. So the question is, if we're adopting phenomenal conservatism, are there defeaters? Are there reasons to doubt that seeming? Well, we can distinguish between two kinds of defeater. First, undercutting defeaters, right? Are there grounds for thinking the way I formed the belief was kind of messed up? And there's an obvious one here, isn't it? It was caused by a drug, right? You can think it was a drug messing with your brain. I was talking to my friend Paul Taylor, a PhD, philosophy PhD student in Liverpool, and he was very skeptical. I said, look, you know, what's the difference between what I know about the external world, like there's a table here, and what seemed known in this experience? And he's from Liverpool. He said, look, mate, you licked a toad. That's the difference. So I thought that was a kind of amusing way to, actually, you don't lick, this is sort of vaping. But anyway, so there's a natural thought there. But I think we need to ask, well, you know, what is the drug doing? And I think there's two possibilities. It could be causing a hallucination. But here's another possibility of what it could be doing. Another possibility I think that fits with how things seemed in the experience. So coming back to this light bulb wrapped in cotton wool, as I said, it seemed like the cotton wool, which represents my conscious mind, was being torn away. It seems like my conscious mind was being shut down. Like this, I mean, like the subject of my experience, the particular subject of experience that is Philip Goff, my conscious mind was being shut down, and something sort of, in some sense, underlying that was being revealed on that basis. So it could be that that's what the drug is doing, right? It could be that the drug is dampening down neural activity and temporarily shutting down my conscious mind. Now, I don't know enough about the neurophysiology to fully assess that claim. I would like to look more into this. This is all relatively new. But Christoph Koch, who's had the same experience, he tells me, you know, it's somewhat contentious, but there are a couple of papers suggesting yet it is indeed lowering neural activity. There's sort of lower frequency oscillations. Now, to be clear, I just want to be very clear. I am not offering an empirical argument that this was veridical. Not at all. Not at all. I think that's very unconvincing. My reason for believing it is rooted in it seemed true, right? It seemed, and if that seems rubbish, well, I think that's the same motivation, that's the same justification for anything I know about the external world or science, right? Ultimately, it cashes out in it seemed true. And this seemed more true than ordinary empirical knowledge. So, I mean, just, you know, there's a table in front of me. So I want to say it's at least as rational to believe in it what this experience suggested as it is to believe in ordinary sensory experiences. What I'm doing here, talking about the neurophysiology, is removing a defeater. So I think if we're going to have a defeater here, we've got to have an established empirical case that it's causing a hallucination rather than doing the other thing, just kind of shutting down my conscious mind. No, maybe that can be done, but there's an onus there on somebody to do it. Okay, here's a very different kind of defeater, ill fit with what is known, right? So if you seem to see a pig flying through the sky, right? And it really seems, oh my God, it really seems like there's a flying pig. I think you've got reason to think you're hallucinating because that doesn't fit with what you take yourself to know about reality. So you've got reason to think it's a hallucination, right? It's not a free for all. So now we need to ask, okay, what was suggested in this experience? Does that fit with what one takes oneself to know? Well, it depends, I think, on your philosophical view on consciousness. So here's a great philosopher looking very enigmatic and profound here, as he is, from his, as I know very well, David Papineau. I think if David, and I'm sure many of you here today, who are physicalists, so this is the reason I'm picking out David, that he's a physicalist. If you're a physicalist and you smoke some toad venom and you have this experience, I think you do have reason to think it's a hallucination, right? Because it doesn't fit with what you take yourself to already know. It's like the flying pig, right? And I mean, interestingly, it insofar as this experience involves kind of radical unity at the fundamental level or at a deeper level of reality, that doesn't necessarily clash, because I think, quantum entanglement is strong evidence for some kind of radical unity at the fundamental level. Jonathan Schaffer's argued quite powerfully for that, I think. So that's interesting. But there's lots of other things that don't fit with physicalism. I mean, for start, that there is consciousness at the fundamental level, or at a more fundamental level. I want to say this experience, if it's veridical, there is consciousness at a more fundamental level. Yeah, I don't think I quite emphasized before. That's the sense in which I wasn't there, right? That this subject of experience, Philip Goff, is a particular thing, but at this level of at this realm of reality, realm sounds a bit woo-woo, doesn't it? Region of reality, if I could put it that way. It's not the case that there are any things, right? So that's the sense in which I did not exist in this region of reality if the experience is veridical. And so in that sense, I think it's if it's veridical, it's a sort of deeper level of reality. I'm talking about region of reality. Again, you have to cut me a bit of slack. I hope I've able to put the claim more precisely as I did earlier. Okay, so anyway, speaking a little bit loosely, there's consciousness at the fundamental level of reality. So I think if Papineau smokes some toad venom, he could say, oh, that was a hallucination, because it was telling me something that I already know is false. Fine. Okay, the other thing I think is, and this is going to be an interesting case for my own view actually, is that I think if the experience is veridical, I have direct access to the fundamental level via memory of the experience. So, I mean, as I said, if the experience is veridical, I was not there when the experience happened, weird as that sounds, but I'm here now, and I can form a propositional based on my memory of the experience, and I think that gives me insight, maybe not quite direct, but insight into a more fundamental level of reality. Maybe I shouldn't be saying fundamental, actually. More, I think to fit with the content of the experience, it's a more fundamental level of reality. Whereas on physicalism, consciousness is neurobiological and local, so you just can't accommodate that. So, to be clear with what I am claiming, if you are a physicalist and you have this experience, I think it's perfectly rational to say that was a hallucination. But what if you're a panpsychist like myself? Here's a picture of Hedda Hasselmerk and me, and and Jeff Lee, who's not a panpsychist, very interesting physicalist philosopher. And this was a conference years ago in Lady Elliot Island in Australia that Chalmers staged. Anyway, a lot of the coral that we swam in at that conference no longer exists due to climate break down, sadly. Anyway, right. Well, I want to say, if I'm a panpsychist, there's nothing in my worldview that is a defeater, that constitutes a defeater. So, I mean, firstly, I can follow the physics and think, you know, it's plausible that there is a radical unity. I mean, I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying quantum entanglement gives us quite the radical unity I'm saying this experience suggested, but I mean, maybe it's something a little bit looser, like Jonathan Schaffer's priority monism, but there's, you know, it fits with radical unity at the fundamental level. Okay, and also, so this experience suggests there's consciousness at a deeper level. I don't think, again, I think that's a bit of a typo to say fundamental level. But if you're panpsychist, you already think there's consciousness at the fundamental level, so no clash there. Now, here's the trickier bit. Well, what about this direct access to the fundamental level via a memory? I mean, I think many panpsychists who are more sort of, what word can I use? Reductionist, maybe. David Chalmers, Luke Roloffs, Angela Mendelevici. I think they're going to be very suspicious of this. You know, claims that we can, through these kind of mystical experiences, know the ultimate nature of reality or a more fundamental level of reality. I think lots of panpsychists are going to be very skeptical of this. But I want to say they shouldn't be. Because I'm still thinking this out. But I mean, look, if you're a panpsychist, you hold the view that in somehow mental representation, there is mental representation of intrinsic nature, right? Because we represent our own consciousness in our thoughts about our consciousness, and for a panpsychist, consciousness is sort of the intrinsic nature of the physical. So somehow, and Keith Frankish is always pushing on me that, you know, how is that possible? And maybe you think this is not just, maybe you think this is a problem for panpsychism. We could discuss that. But if you're a panpsychist, you have to think in some way there is in one's mind mental representation of intrinsic nature. So perhaps I can't see anything in panpsychism that rules out the following, that memory forming representations can survive the destruction of the subjective experience, right? Seems to me nothing in panpsychism entails that, but it doesn't cast doubt on it that it could be in some unusual situations that, you know, my conscious mind is stopped, but some memory forming mental representation processes are still continuing and capturing the intrinsic nature of what remains. And, you know, on this view, I would say this pure consciousness business is, if this experience is veridical, is part of the intrinsic nature of consciousness, of physical reality. So if that were the case, then I think we can make sense of the idea that we can have via memory mental representations of what's going on at the ultimate level of reality. Strange as that sounds. Okay, so basically I'm saying there's nothing in panpsychism entails that, but that nothing in panpsychism casts any doubt on that. So importantly, you don't have a defeater. Okay, so assuming phenomenal conservatism, I would say, given that I am a panpsychist, and I think that belief's justified. Maybe that's another conditional. Actually, the belief has to be justified, I suppose. If we could, you know, but there's going to be a big debate there. At least put it this way: if my belief in panpsychism is justified, and I have this experience where it really seems to be the case, what the experience reveals, then I think it's rational for me to trust that, because I think there's no defeater. It seems more true than ordinary empirical knowledge, and there's no defeater. Okay, so I think it's rational for me to believe this. Okay, well, that's just considering one theory of justification. There's a loud lawnmower outside my windows, which are open because of the heat wave. I'll just very quickly shut my windows. Okay, so now I will turn to other theories of justification. I think I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. Okay, and if you've got some, I'm just starting to think about this. If you've got other theories I haven't considered, I'd love to hear them. Okay, so reliabilism, roughly the view that a belief is justified if it's formed through a reliable mechanism. Well, look, here the question is it's all going to come down to, is it rational? Whether it's rational to trust the 5-MeO DMT experience depends on if taking the 5-MeO DMT experience leads to a rational belief, which, is it creating a hallucination, or is it shutting down the conscious mind and revealing something at a deeper level, a more fundamental level? Trying to avoid woo-sounding terms. And, I don't know, how do we establish that, right? I don't know if people can help me out. I never know how, when it's an externalist theory where the kind of the source of justification is sort of outside of what we have access to. I never know how we establish these disputes, I don't know. Okay, I insofar as it's okay for a standard reliabilist to just assume that they're not in the matrix and that their sensors are reliable and they form beliefs on that basis and take them to rational. Well, I'm just going to do the same thing. You can play that game, I can play it too. I'm just going to assume that the way I form the belief is a reliable mechanism. So that's why, I just get completely lost with externalism. That's why I have more internalist intuitions, although that wasn't much of an argument, what I just said. Okay, what about coherentism? So I've been given foundationalist views. What about coherentism? That, you get justification from coherence between your beliefs. Well, I think we're going to get the same result, right? If you're a panpsychist, then the 5-MeO belief, I think, coheres well with your view of fundamental reality, that there's consciousness down there, which is what panpsychism suggests. You've got a nice coherence. If you're a physicalist, it doesn't. So I think we'll get the same result. Now, here's the interesting one. What about proper functionalism, the view of Elvin Planting pictured here, which is that you get justified beliefs when they are formed through the proper functioning of the cognitive system or the perceptual system or what have you. Now, he thinks our cognitive systems were designed by God, and so you have the proper functioning when they're doing what God designed them for. But there are also atheistic forms of proper functionalism where it's evolution. Is David? I can't remember now, David, whether you hold this view. Anyway, we'll find out at some point. Where it's evolution has shaped the function, okay, that's relevant to determining justification. Now, here I want to say, well, look, if you have Plantinger's view, then it could just be that this method of belief forming is part of God's plan, right? Again, it's this sort of impasse you get to with externalism. I'm just going to say that's the case. I don't know how you establish it if you're an externalist one way or the other. Now, if you are an atheist proper functionalist, then I think you can say there's no justification. Fine. Okay? So if you think, no, justified beliefs are those that are formed through what evolution has shaped our cognitive systems or our perceptual systems for, that's when you get justification. Well, no, I mean, clearly evolution hasn't shaped us to do this. And I'm thinking about it as I say it. Anyway, it seems pretty plausible that it would, evolution interested in survival hasn't shaped us. So here's something I want to say, if you're an atheist proper functionalist, then you can say, no, my toad venom experience wasn't justified. But look, okay, that's interesting. But it's, it's a quite minority view about justification. But anyway, it's a conditional claim. Okay, well, here's final thing I want to just very quickly, should you believe me? I mean, I'm inclined to picture of Richard Swinburne here. So let's have Richard Swinburne here. It defends what he calls the testimony principle. I'm carving things up a little bit different to Swinburne here, but it's kind of essentially the same point. Okay, so the question here is, right, I've argued so far that as a panpsychist, it's rational for me to believe what that experience suggested, but should you believe me when I tell you about it? Okay, so here's the testimony principle. If X tells Y that it seems to X the P, then in the absence of defeaters, Y has at least some justification for believing the P. And then I think this is going to be derived from two more basic components. Firstly, if X tells Y that it seems to X the P, then in the absence of defeaters, Y has at least some justification for believing that it seems to X the P. And then the second component, for any distinct persons X and Y, if X knows that it seems to X the P, then in the absence of defeaters, Y has at least some justification for believing the P. So on the first component, again, I think it's going to be just as earlier in the defense of phenomenal conservatism, I said, look, this is what you have to accept if you're going to avoid skepticism. I think it's going to be this kind of similar argument that, look, so much of our knowledge is based on testimony. You know, I don't know the evidence for the age of the universe, but I believe what the scientists tell me. And now you might think, okay, but they've proven themselves. They've got, you know, we can look at how well they've done. Well, I mean, we can, but most of us haven't checked that out. Most of us haven't, you know, gone through, looked in detail at how each of these scientific bodies have done. You know, we take people's word for it. And, you know, I think, you know, Hume's view about testimony that, you know, you can't believe testimony. You've got to establish that it's a source of testimony that's got things right largely over time. I think it's completely unrealistic. I think if we stuck to that, we'd be in radical skepticism. You know, not about the external world maybe, but about much of what we take ourselves to know. So I think we do have to have some sort of default. Again, it's not a free for all because of the defeater clause, but some sort of default for trusting testimony. At least in terms of how things seem to people, right? So this is going beyond phenomenal conservatism, by the way. I think, you know, we have to add something kind of basic about testimony. Okay, what about the second component? I mean, here it's just, I suppose, that although seemings are sort of subjective, truth is objective. It's not like truth for me, truth for you. So insofar as, you know, we're thinking, if I'm thinking, David, if I'm a phenomenal conservatism, so if I, you know, something seems a certain way to David Papineau, and I believe that gives him reason to believe that is indeed the case. Well, it's not just like a reason. If there's a reason to believe it's true, then there's a reason to believe it's true, right? It's not like true for David and not true for me, you know. If there's a reason, if I genuinely think Papineau has a reason to believe something, then that's a reason that should apply to my belief formation as well. I should, you know, raise my epistemic probability in that truth claim because there is a reason to believe it. Of course, now I don't just believe everything David says because there's complexities, there's defeaters, there's different seemings need to be balanced to get into philosophy, but still, I think there is some basic default to testimony. So, physicalists in the audience, I don't think you should believe me. Or at least there's yeah, let me just put it that way. But if you're a panpsychist, and I think you, unless you think there's some good reason I'm lying or something, I think you should believe me. And so I think you should believe the truth claim embodied by this experience that there is this timeless, spaceless, impersonal consciousness underlying all things. Okay, so summary. In 5-MeO-DMT experiences, there seems to be a timeless form of undifferentiated consciousness, a completely unstructured propositional claim. If one is a panpsychist, it's rational, I think, to trust these experiences. I mean, physicalists, if physicalists actually have the, I mean, Christoph Koch has changed his worldview on the basis of this experience, because he's become some kind of idealist now. So look, there's going to be a balancing act, right? Bayesian terms, you're going to think about the prior probabilities, but you're also going to think about the strength of the evidence as a balancing act. But anyway, I can see how it can be rational for a physicalist to think that was a hallucination if they have that experience. But I think it's rational for me to believe it was true. Okay. Thank you for listening.